what was the most refreshing idea you have heard so far?
The most refreshing idea? I think it was really the sense that borders are a negative aspect, and in my mind that means that cities are a very positive aspect of our lives. For me, a national identity is one that's fabricated. Somehow a city seems more organic, more real.
Okay, well, thank you so much, and I speak to you after your presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Sudjic.
We were talking earlier about how you communicate with an audience. Do you do it sitting on a sofa, talking to somebody, or do you do it standing up like a revivalist preacher, or behind the lectern like a tutor? And one point was that you want to make friends by sitting down and talking to someone, and I certainly don't want to make any enemies, so I'm going to do this talk sitting down. Apart from that thing about borders and cities, one of the other things that I came away from this morning, which I thought was an amazing range of ideas, and actually you could see conflict underway as well, but was the sense that though in general I think that talking about national identity is a really dangerous thing because it becomes a caricature very quickly, there are certain things that do reveal something about where someone comes from or the way they see the world. When the British come to Holland or the Netherlands, initially they feel they haven't gone very far away. There's a queen, people drink beer, brown bars, these very charming Amsterdam canal houses with bricks and sliding windows. So we think pretty much we're actually at home. And then we realize, of course, that there's actually nowhere more foreign in the world, except possibly Japan, because unlike the British, who are deep down pretty sentimental about things, there's a certain ruthless streak to the Dutch imagination, that understanding that the landscape is man-made and there's no point in pretending anything else about it. So one sees schemes like MVRDVs this morning or Aframtjepsmers, sorry I mispronounced that terribly, which are easily misunderstood outside the Netherlands. Are these projects which are asking questions, or are they projects which are proposals? Are they something that we should understand as a real proposal? And when one sees those in the context of what we also saw this morning from Mumbai, it becomes clear that there is a lot of potential for misunderstandings there. I like the idea of this being an activist look at design, because it makes me, in particular, ask myself the question about whether I'm an activist or an observer. Certainly, though I trained as an architect, I realized very early on it was my patriotic duty never to build anything on the basis of my general incompetence, and I became a critic and a writer whose main job is to try and stop things from happening. A museum director is something rather else. I mean, museum is quite a heavy word, and it was one that was deliberately chosen when the Design Museum was founded 25 years ago, because there was a sense that design, in the UK at least, wasn't being treated with quite the, respect's the wrong word, seriousness, wrong word also, it wasn't being paid attention to by the wider community. So there was a sense that this is a vulnerable area which needs a heavy word like museum around it, which of course implies lots of valuable things in glass cases. And that's not what we do at the Design Museum. We see ourselves as, in some aspects, an activist museum. We like to make things happen. We like to provide a platform, to look at debate, to encourage people to talk, to look at where things might be moving, which is good. But the other aspect of activism, of course, is that it implies a manifesto. And I don't think this is a time for manifestos. We seem to have, as a generation, lost the belief that design will save the world. We don't, by and large, go back to the early modernist moment when there was a sense that 10-point programs could make the world a better place, mainly because we've seen so many utopias go sour, and we believe that design can very easily make things a lot worse rather than very much better. So design has become something else. Design seems to have become about telling stories, or about criticism, or about asking questions. Maybe that's not that new. You could actually understand William Morris as being a designer who believed in socialist utopia. He was a revolutionary socialist and also a wallpaper designer, which is quite a complicated mixture of things to be doing. And he believed, of course, that machines were the work of the devil and that it was his job to try to make wonderful objects for the masses. But of course, since he didn't believe in the machine, the masses couldn't afford what he was doing. So you'd have to actually look at his work as asking just as many questions as some of the things that come out of critical design today. The exciting thing to me about design is that there is no one definition, that it can be a subject whose definition is continually shifting, it's melting into other things. If design in a museum was only about the history of chairs, it would be dead almost at once. But design, to me, is a way to understand the world around us. And one of the key things about the world around us is that we are, as we heard earlier, becoming majority urban. It's something that I became aware of when I joined a research project at the London School of Economics a couple of years ago, funded by Deutsche Bank, whose aim was really to track the moment when, as the United Nations predicting, the world became majority urban for the first time in history. An event which has probably happened now, we can't be quite sure. And it was treated before it happened a bit like the countdown to the millennium. It was actually presented as some kind of epochal shift, like the moment that mankind emerged from the water, perhaps. Something was actually going to change us. That's not quite right, but I think what it did make us think about was the need to think about cities in a slightly different way. Very much in the way that Rohan was describing how there can be an academic view, a political view, or a capitalist view of design. I think the way that the city is understood is by different groups of people who tend never to be in the same room together, and if they are, to despise one another. But really to understand a city or to try and engage with it, you need to look at legal systems, you need to look at what politicians are doing, you need to understand what a planner and a sociologist or a transport planner can do. And so the premise behind the Urban Age project was that a working group in London was formed around these many disciplines, and that over a course of several years, this group moved around the globe, looking at different cities, meeting similar groups of people in each of those cities. But the first stage was a great deal of research, and this kind of very Dutch version of kind of information gathering, one could say. But this is a map which shows mankind's footprint over the world. This is showing where the major cities are growing and the speed with which they're growing. This is showing the major urbanized areas of the world. This is showing air traffic. This is showing sea traffic, cities growing, etc., etc. We're rather scared about cities. Ever since the 19th century, when Morris began thinking about design, there was a sense that the city was a fundamentally negative thing. And it's not surprising when you saw the 19th century industrial city, which was probably in the West equally grim to what some of the slums of the South are now. And it produced a kind of reaction against them, the idea that cities were somehow dark, dangerous places full of the urban poor who were to be shunned, and the sense that utopia was basically going to be unurban, that the garden city was developed as a concept by Ebenezer Howard, the sense that a rural idyll was somehow the way forward. And as we've watched the city grow, it's an attitude which continues to underpin a lot of views about what city thinking is like. So even now, the green agenda is to say that cities are swallowing land and that they are huge producers of CO2, which is true. On the other hand, 53% of the world are now urbanized, and they occupy 2% of the world's land area. So one could see cities as being a fundamentally positive thing. What's this one? Oh, yeah. This is also telling us that 33% of city dwellers live in slums, so these are not utopias. And this is looking at how the informal sector live. I was really very interested in the conversation about Dharavi because it's interesting how the slum has now become research material for a new generation of thinkers or activists or doers. I was very interested to hear that the Prince of Wales, for example, made a visit to Mumbai. Allegedly, he had a special water closet installed for his use when he was there. But there is a sense that looking at some of the figures about how people consume or don't consume, comparing things like travel to work times, comparing energy use, there's some things about the slums which are almost all right. They are things that the West is now beginning to think about in terms of offering ideas of how lower energy, other means of maybe mixing work might be something to learn from. Oh yes, that's the CO2 statistic. And that's the number of urban poor who've grown. The thing about the city is that it could be understood as a very successful machine for making the very poor not so poor as time goes by. They can be seen as places in which there is a much wider range of possibilities offered by the possibilities for work than there is in the rural context. That's why the rural poor head for the cities. And a successful city is one in which the largest percentage of its inhabitants have the widest range of choices. But there are also places which, of course, are producing somewhat extreme phenomena. This is perhaps the world's first high-rise palace in Mumbai. How does one deal with these issues? Because we don't believe in manifestos, we seem to have given up the idea of grand, big plans. We can adopt medium-sized plans. This is a Chilean example of what affordable housing could be in providing a sense of dignity. I mean, the key thing about the slums is probably land tenure. If you're an informal settlement, you have no title to your land, so you can't use the equity in it. And when the slums are rebuilt, usually the occupants are banished to the far edges of the city. That's the Shanghai model. A Latin American different model might be the idea of building the minimum that can be afforded in terms of providing infrastructure for the inhabitants, and then leaving them to finish the rest of the dwelling as they have the resources and move on in the world. Sorry, this is a grand plan approach. This is Zaha Hadid's scheme for rebuilding most of Istanbul. This is from Sao Paulo. It's Herzog Nemorin's plans for a big intervention in the center of the city, replacing a bus station with an arts complex. So there are big plans. Then there are attempts to deal with the city by pretending that nothing is happening. This is the Prince of Wales' ideal community in Poundbury, in Dorset, where there is an idea that if you keep your eyes shut, you will not notice that the world has changed around you, and that if you provide the symbols of the familiar, you can somehow believe it's not actually going to happen. Small-scale interventions. This is the famous scheme in Sao Paulo where the governor did a giant version of that, reclaiming the public space from advertising, leaving just the rather elegant frames of the highway signs. This is the modest level of what design can do for a city, but perhaps the most effective. One of the problems about Dharavi is the lack of sanitation, and this is a scheme to build public latrines within the community, which save lives, literally, because defecating quite often takes place on railway tracks in this area, and this is a much more secure and dignified approach to hygiene. It could be seen as a very powerful example of what design can do for the world in a kind of starting on a very basic level, but one which actually has a huge impact on people's dignity and the way they see themselves and the quality of life that they have. What is that? Oh, yeah. Even the first world needs to think about where things are going. Low low-income manufacturing jobs are vanishing from Western cities with remarkable speed. And there are one or two initiatives which may help to reverse that. This is American Apparel, which manufactures, makes, designs, and sells in American cities. This is a kind of meditation, I suppose, on the way that the North sees the South. It's a religious festival in Mumbai. It's a place in which we see things that we are fascinated by. For example, the distribution system of the Tiffin project, the way that workers get their midday meals delivered to them throughout the city by a network of usually cycle couriers, is a marvel of logistics, which doesn't depend on computers, which lots of things could inform a kind of Western distribution system. The system of transforming lawns on the Maidan from cricket pitches to wedding pavilions happens overnight, and again is orchestrated with a marvelous energy and dispatch, and creates a kind of way to work. These are things of social organisation in cities that we can all learn from, and one can also think about when bad things happen to Mumbai, like flooding, the response was far more organised and inspiring than what happened when Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans. The poor came out to rescue drivers who were in danger of being washed away on the roads above them. There was a sense of solidarity and community. But again, this is not something that we should become misty-eyed about, but it's a fact that there are aspects of life which we need to learn from. And that same school which we saw earlier. What's this one? Yeah, this is again the informalness of the Mumbai economy. This is Sao Paulo. A city which could not be more different from Mumbai in many ways, even though it has similar inequalities and confrontations. And of course, it's the city which has more helicopters registered per head than anywhere else in the world, in which commuting is, can be airborne for a certain group. It's a city which needs to be come to terms with. Until the 1960s, Los Angeles was seen as a nowhere city until it actually found the voice of Raina Banham, who approached the city from the point of view of a design critic and observer, and really gave an extraordinary account of how Los Angeles developed from rural orange groves to the movie industry, to air and space, to become the city that it is today. And I think Sao Paulo needs to have that same story told to the outsiders, because it is one of the largest cities in the world, one of the cities that's grown most rapidly, and one which is now rapidly approaching the kind of the status of the North. Brazil is not simply a country of the Campana brothers, it's also the country of Embraer, which makes the aeroplane which I flew here from in London. It's a city which is having to come to grips with problems of design which are not only physical design but also the design of a city administration, a sense of how boundaries and borders are made. One of the things that we need to deal with as designers is what it means to have a city that is larger than many countries. What are the things that create that sense of cohesion and unity? Or can it survive? I mean, again, going back to the Dutch example, on one level, the Netherlands are one giant city. Everything seems to touch. People will live in what they call Rotterdam and work in what they call Amsterdam. The two touch. And yet, though it could be seen as one thing, people are fiercely proud of their individual identity, and they identify themselves as citizens much more than a group. And what is it that actually keeps those things going? It's accents, it's football teams, it's newspapers, but these are things that are perhaps eroding, and the question really is what maintains those senses of cityness, of an identity that is shared. As I was saying, it is. I think that the most positive sense of identification is with the city. I was born in Britain, but I would describe myself as being from London. London seems a much more generous and inviting self-definition. London has, of course, existed for far longer than anything that could be called England has, and it is an unthreatening identity. It's a city which allows people to inhabit the same space, to overlap, but to ignore each other if they want, or to work together if they wish. There was a great film made by Anthony Minghella a couple of years ago, which starred Jude Law as a landscape architect, and it showed his studio in the King's Cross area, and it really followed it through the various stages of the day. So in office hours, it's that sunlit, scrubbed brick yuppie utopia with pot plants and drawing boards and computers. And then as it gets dark, the Nigerian cleaners come in. And then at night, they're the hookers and the drug dealers outside. And these are aspects of city life which show that not all aspects of a city are light. There's dark aspects to it too. And it's the way that those layers overlap each other that really creates for me what the essence of a city is. Of course, that also depends on a sense of security, a sense of a stake in a community, and one can see there are examples in which, as Sukhdev Mehta said in Maximum City, intercommunal violence also lurks in the slums, and there is communal stress within cities too. And so the successful city, to me, is that one which allows for the maximum number of its citizens to get the most out of it. Thanks very much.